I first heard about and knew about the Doctrine of Discovery at General Assembly in 2012 in Phoenix, Arizona. What is the Doctrine of Discovery? I think it can be best briefly described as the belief that because the lands of the Western Hemisphere were without Christians prior to 1492, they were free for the taking upon quote-unquote discovery. So they were the theological justification for the intertwined theological and legal and political expropriation of lands from indigenous peoples during the European conquest and colonization of the Americas. So I learned about this doctrine of discovery, this Christian doctrine of discovery at General Assembly in 2012, and this was specifically designated as a Justice General Assembly. So a lot of what was going on was us working on justice resolutions and doing actions of social witness. So if you can imagine a gathering that was sort of broadly divided into folks getting together in large groups to be in sort of rows upon rows of people discussing and voting upon resolutions indoors in big rooms with no windows versus getting on buses to drive out into the desert outside of Sheriff Arpaio's camps of folks who were getting ready to be deported. You can guess which one of those things kind of appealed to me more as an attendee. I wasn't quite impolite enough to go out and get on the bus and start honking the horn to say, hey, everybody, out of the resolution writing process. Let's just skip the queue, get on the bus, go straight to the marches. But it was close. I was really anxious and impatient, I have to admit. Luckily, the attendees at General Assembly were not just smart folks like me. There were wise ones who wanted to lay the foundation for not just days and weeks of our actions and activities, but ones that would have an impact over years and decades, which is what this resolution writing process was, what this repudiation resolution writing process was. I have to admit that I was supportive of having a resolution to repudiate the doctrine of discovery, but I didn't entirely see the point. I wasn't entirely convinced of why this was necessarily the best use of our efforts and energies at a large gathering of Unitarian Universalists, a large assembly of our people. After all, this is something that was over 500 years ago, and I know that we have stumbled since then, that subsequent centuries and generations have struggled in our efforts at being anti-racist and anti-oppressive, but I felt like with my lens as a millennial, as someone who has seen kind of how we bring up children now and how I feel like we're bringing up future generations, like we have a pretty good handle on how to raise our kids in a way that makes formal repudiation of backwards things like the doctrine of discovery kind of redundant. Like we are raising the generations at this point in such a way that it's beside the point to actually go back and say that something as backwards as the doctrine of discovery is wrong, is just kind of so clear and obvious that why bother to put that on paper and formally state it when there are so many direct actions that we could be taking. I felt like, why are we in here going through that whole process when we could be out chanting potentially hurtful things at Sheriff Joe Arpaio? Doesn't that sound like way more fun? Let's go practice our microphone checks so that we can be heard out in the real world. Well, first of all, it was over 110 degrees every day that week in Phoenix. So it would have been dangerous and unhealthy to go out into the desert during the day anyway. So good call by the organizers of those protests to not have us out there during the days. And second of all, there was a lot of impactful and sustaining prophetic witness that happened that week, and an impressively delayed and lasting impact from the resolution and repudiation. I gathered both the starting place for this service and much of the material from a UUA webpage that Pat Kahn, UUCA's former Director of Religious Education and our Unitarian Universalist Association's Director of Curricular Development, compiled about the doctrine of discovery and her role as Director of Curricular Development. That was an outcome of that resolution on the doctrine of discovery. So there were a lot of ripples that kind of came out of that resolution that we passed, things that wouldn't have necessarily come about for 3 or 4 years later if we hadn't have spent that time having those discussions in that room, if we hadn't have put those things on paper and formally passed that resolution. I compared a little bit to our process here at UUCA of going through the process of passing an anti-racism, anti-oppression, multiculturalism resolution earlier this year, where a lot of the feedback that we got was, a lot of this stuff is things that we feel like we kind of already believe anyways, and why do we need to necessarily write this down and talk about how we all sort of believe the same thing together? Isn't this maybe redundant? Aren't there other things that we could be spending our time on together as a congregation? And my hope for that resolution is that when we look back in 4 or 5 years, is that we'll see unexpected ripples having come out of that process of steps that we took, curricula that we dedicated ourselves to, that we hadn't necessarily expected at the time, but that we say, there's a step that if we hadn't been engaged in that process, if we hadn't formally committed ourselves to taking this step, then we wouldn't have necessarily been in this place in 2020 or 2021 because of that step that we took in 2016. That was how I felt sitting here in 2016, looking at some of the resources that we've created for ourselves since that General Assembly in 2012. There was a sermon that I'm going to talk about that came out of the Doctrine of Discovery resources created in the wake of that 2012 General Assembly. And I think perhaps most significantly, once we had formally repudiated the Doctrine of Discovery in that 2012 General Assembly, this fall, at Standing Rock, the president of our Unitarian Universalist Association, Reverend Peter Morales, was able to go there, and the heads of all the denominations that had formally repudiated the Doctrine of Discovery were invited to take copies of that document, torn up, and to bring them to the sacred fire there at Standing Rock, and to throw them in. And it's very rare and very symbolic that anything is thrown into a sacred fire. And so when I heard this story, that he was one of the leaders who was invited to throw that document into the sacred fire there at the protest campsite, I was so glad and so proud that we had taken this step as a denomination to formally repudiate the doctrine of discovery, that we had invested the time for so many reasons, but for that reason in particular, that had been part of the outcome of our process, for him to be able to tear that up and to throw it into the sacred fire, to be one of the leaders who could do that at Standing Rock. That was so important. In going a little bit more into the specifics of the doctrine of discovery and how it has shaped and harmed our world, literally, I would like to quote Reverend Colin Bosson, a UU academic and doctoral candidate at Harvard Divinity School, whose 2012 sermon, "This Land is Your Land?" ? I am greatly indebted to for many of the ideas and explanations in this morning's message. You can find his original sermon and many of his writings at colinbosson.com, and I encourage folks to check that out. He writes, "The Assembly passed the resolution repudiating the doctrine at the request of organizations we have been working with in Arizona to oppose that state's racist anti-immigrant laws. When we began to work with them in 2010, we discovered something surprising. They viewed Arizona's laws as part of a continual process of colonization that stretched back to Christopher Columbus." Bosson continues, "Columbus's quote-unquote discovery of the Americas prompted European political and religious leaders to develop what indigenous activists refer to as the, quote, Christian doctrine of discovery. This is the belief that because the lands of the Western Hemisphere were without Christians prior to 1492, they were free for the taking upon discovery. For indigenous activists in Arizona, the issues at stake in the state's racist laws are as much political as theological. The history of Christian doctrine of discovery can be traced to a series of 15th century papal bulls and treaties between Spain and Portugal. These documents created a theological and legal framework that justified the expropriation and division of indigenous lands by Spain and Portugal. And what is especially upsetting about the doctrine is that the framework it created to facilitate the seizure of indigenous lands continues to form the core of much of federal property law today. That is particularly true as it relates to indigenous property claims. As recently as 2005, the U.S. Supreme Court had cited the doctrine in their decisions. So it is non-trivial for us as a U.S. religious organization to have repudiated this doctrine, because theological support for the expropriation of native lands was as much a part of its basis as political support. The two were and are intertwined. They have been for centuries. We are using our power, that power of theological justification that was and is intertwined with political and legal justification for that expropriation of indigenous lands historically. Still, as you can hear, as recently as 2005 by the Supreme Court, being used as justification for the way that the United States is expropriating indigenous lands. And it's hard to talk about the power of the Unitarian Universalist Association as a theological entity in this kind of work in the same week as the federal government has announced its intentions to shut down the campsite of protesters at Standing Rock, and to feel like what we do is making a difference and is empowering on the side of indigenous protesters and those who would seek to empower justice and equity and go against the tide of centuries of unjust expropriation of native lands in this country and on this continent. But what we do is counter with creativity and persistence at each step that injustice and this inequity. And that's who we are, and that's what we will continue to do. This word expropriation, by the way, is one of the reasons I am not an academic theologian, I have to say. I was trying to explain to my family this week at Thanksgiving what the doctrine of discovery is, and all I could come up with was appropriation, and I knew there was another word out there. My cousin chimed in with colonization, and I was like, yeah, no, that's helpful, but I know there's another term in there, and I felt like this was really good Thanksgiving table talk. I felt like this was a good conversation for us to be having as a family on the one hand, but on the other hand, it made me so upset to be thinking just about the idea of a pope being able to remove lands from indigenous peoples, not even for his own use, but to give to a third party because they happen to be Christian, that it made me want to throw up so hard. It made it a lot harder to enjoy my dad's amazing gravy. So I was a little bit torn about whether this was a good thing to be talking about at the Thanksgiving table. So I don't know. I love in Reverend Boston's award-winning sermon his use of "this land is your land" as a motif. And you may be wondering, how the heck does a Woody Guthrie reference work itself in here? I love that singer and that song as much as the next person, but he's got lines about from California to the New York Islands with nary a mention of indigenous tribes nor people. There's a verse, though, that I was reminded of when I was reading it that I had never heard in school, certainly, but rather in the subversion cell that was my local UU congregation growing up. It is, as I was walking, I saw a sign there, and that sign said, "Private property." But on the other side, it didn't say nothing. Now that side was made for you and me. I'm going to set aside the question of literal regard for private property this morning, although I would like to make quite explicit my hope that during this time of high stress, Unitarian Universalist congregations will be, as they historically have been, a bridge between liberals and leftists. Instead, let's take for a moment the question of private property as a metaphor. For every warning, explicit and implicit, in the world and in our heads, there is another side that doesn't say nothing. And I'd like to suggest that sometimes that's the side that's made for you and me. What does it look like, that risky, liminal area on the unlabeled side of the sign that we are traditionally way less comfortable with? The first line of my outline for this section has the crossed out words, "Unlabeled Sign Side Committee." So I don't think we should go with that. But certainly reaching out to Native American groups, whether in Georgia or that we are connected with through family or in other ways that we might be able to connect with, I think is an important and positive way to start. This is something that I want to encourage folks to definitely do and to follow through with if that is something that you are called to or able to do. And I think this is also an opportunity for us to up our intercultural game, to get better at reaching out across racial, ethnic, and faith lines, something that we are persistently called to do, and that this is a good opportunity to do. I'm going to put on my religious exploration hat here and say that there are great curricula, especially from the FOS Collaborative, that can help us to do this work as a congregation, and talented religious educators working with our children and youth who are so skilled and dedicated that if I think about it too much, I'm going to get choked up and not be able to finish. If you want to get your hands on one of those curricula, working with a group of adults here or with our children and youth, I will be right over there after the service. I will be the minister who is ready to press a Starbucks gift card into your hand in gratitude for your interest. Folks, we are called to contemplate the land and the work of repairing the world. And in both cases, it is not yours or mine, but ours. Allies, we have been able to ignore these harmful realities for too long, and we are being called in love and need into the struggle for collective liberation. To those who are marginalized and oppressed, we hear you, and you are not alone. I leave us this morning with the words that have kept me going many times in this work, which have been attributed to Lilla Watson, but which come from the Aboriginal activist community. If you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. If you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. Peace, salam, shalom, and may it be so.